Welcome to my channel.
The rain in Lochdubh did not fall so much as it drifted, a fine grey haar that clung to the heather and turned the waters of the sea loch into the colour of a bruised plum. It was the sort of Highland weather that encouraged a sensible man to stay indoors, and Police Constable Hamish Macbeth was nothing if not sensible. In the small police station, which doubled as his home, the peat fire was glowing with a steady, comforting heat. Hamish sat in his worn armchair, his long, gangly legs stretched out toward the hearth. His shock of unruly red hair was slightly damp from a morning patrol that had mostly involved checking if the salmon were jumping near the bridge. Lugs, his ugly but devoted dog of indeterminate breed, lay across his boots, snoring with the rhythmic intensity of a sawmill. Hamish was currently engaged in his favourite form of police work, the slow, methodical consumption of a pot of thick black coffee and the careful study of a seed catalogue. "If we get the early potatoes in by March, Lugs," Hamish murmured, "we might just avoid buying a single bag from that pirate Patel at the village shop." Lugs thumped his tail once, then resumed his slumber. The peace of Lochdubh was a fragile thing, usually preserved by Hamish's ability to turn a blind eye to minor infractions, a bit of poaching here, a late-night drama there, provided the paperwork stayed off his desk. But the peace had been under threat for 3 weeks, ever since Mr. Percival Vane had moved into the old MacLean croft on the hill. Percival Vane was a Sassenach of the most exhausting variety. He was a retired efficiency expert from London who had decided that the Highlands needed modernising. He wore tweed suits that were far too bright, spoke in a voice that carried across 3 glens, and had already written 4 letters of complaint to the Northern Constabulary about the laxity of local law enforcement. The telephone on the desk let out a sharp, demanding jangle. Hamish stared at it with deep suspicion. He considered letting it ring, but the persistence of the tone suggested it wasn't a local looking for a lost sheep. It had the shrill, hysterical energy of an outsider. "Police station, Lochdubh," Hamish said, pitching his voice into the slow, rhythmic lilt that made him sound like a particularly dim-witted shepherd. "Macbeth, is that you? It's Vane." "Percival Vane, aye, Mr. Vane, and a grand morning it is, despite the damp." "It is not a grand morning. It is a morning of utter incompetence. I told you last week that I expected a delivery of high-end vintage wines for my Christmas house party. The delivery van was seen entering the village 2 hours ago, but it has not arrived at my gates. I suspect theft. I suspect a local conspiracy." Hamish sighed, looking longingly at his coffee. "Now, Mr. Vane, the road up to the croft is a bit of a tease. The mist is thick today. He's likely just pulled over for a bit of a rest." "Nonsense. I've been looking for him. I found the van, Macbeth. It's parked in the middle of the track near the standing stones. The engine is running, the door is wide open, but the driver is gone. And more importantly, my case of 1982 Bordeaux is missing from the back." Hamish sat up, his hazel eyes suddenly sharp and clear, though his voice remained a lazy drawl. "An open door and a running engine? And no driver? Exactly. I expect you to be here immediately. And do try to look like a policeman, Macbeth. Put on a tie or something." Hamish hung up the receiver. He looked at Lugs. "The man is a nuisance, Lugs. A loud, complaining, arrogant nuisance. But a running engine and a missing driver." He stood up and reached for his heavy greatcoat. "That sounds like work, and work is the one thing we try to avoid in December." He paused by the mirror, tugging at his lopsided tie. He intentionally left his cap slightly askew. It was always better to look like a fool when dealing with the likes of Vane. People spoke much more freely around a man they didn't respect. As he stepped out into the misty chill, the smell of wood smoke and salt air filled his lungs. Lochdubh looked like a postcard of tranquility, but Hamish felt a familiar cold prickle at the back of his neck. Percival Vane had brought more than just expensive wine and a bad attitude to the Highlands. He had brought a disruption that the quiet village might not easily survive. Hamish climbed into his ancient Land Rover, the engine protesting with a series of metallic coughs before finally settling into a shuddering idle. Luggs scrambled into the passenger seat, his wet fur immediately adding a pungent aroma of damp dog to the interior. As they rattled along the narrow track leading away from the village, the mist thickened, turning the familiar landscape of scrub and stone into a ghostly labyrinth. Hamish drove slowly, his eyes scanning the verges. He knew every dip and curve of this road, and he knew that Percival Vane's house, a refurbished croft that looked more like a glass and steel intrusion than a home, lay just beyond the ancient standing stones that the locals whispered were best avoided in the dark months. The van appeared out of the grey haar like a metallic spectre. It was a sleek, modern delivery vehicle, white and gleaming, which made it look entirely out of place against the rugged backdrop of the Sutherland Hills. As Hamish pulled up behind it, he noted that Vane had not been exaggerating for once. The driver's side door swung rhythmically in the wind, its hinges creaking with a lonely, mournful sound. The engine was indeed humming, a low mechanical thrum that seemed to vibrate through the very peat beneath the tyres. The headlights were still on, two yellow eyes staring uselessly into the fog. Hamish hopped out, his boots squelching in the mud. He didn't approach the cab immediately. Instead, he walked slowly around the car, his hands deep in his pockets. His head tilted as if he were listening to the wind. He saw the tracks in the soft earth. The van had braked sharply, skidding slightly toward the ditch. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, and no blood. Just the empty seat and the smell of exhaust. "Macbeth, over here, man. Honestly, a snail could have crawled from the village faster than you drive that prehistoric contraption." The voice belonged to Percival Vane. He emerged from behind a cluster of gorse bushes, his face a vivid shade of crimson that clashed violently with his mustard-coloured waistcoat. He was waving a silver-topped cane with the agitation of a conductor who had lost his orchestra. Behind him stood a woman Hamish recognised as Vane's latest trophy, a brittle, elegant creature named Cynthia, who looked as though she'd been carved from a block of expensive soap. "Good morning, Mr. Vane," Hamish said mildly, adjusting his cap so it sat even more precariously on his head. "And to you, Mrs. Vane. It's a bit of a damp walk you've had." "It's Miss Thorne," she corrected him with a clipped, icy tone, "and we didn't walk for pleasure. We came to find out why our Christmas supplies were sitting in the middle of the road like an abandoned shipwreck." "Look at the back, Macbeth," Vane barked, gesturing toward the rear doors of the van which were standing ajar. "The thief didn't even have the decency to close them. My vintage Bordeaux is gone. £500 a bottle, and some local ruffian has likely dragged it off to a barn to swill it like cheap cider." Hamish peered into the back of the van. It was mostly full of gourmet hampers, truffles, pâté and cheeses that smelled like unwashed feet. But there was indeed a conspicuous gap where a wooden crate should have been. Yet it wasn't the missing wine that drew Hamish's attention. It was a trail of something dark and viscous that led away from the van toward the standing stones. "The driver, Mr. Vane," Hamish said, his voice dropping an octave. "Did you see any sign of the lad who was driving?" "Probably ran off in terror after realizing he'd been robbed on my watch," Vane scoffed. "Probably in league with the thieves. I want a full report, Macbeth. I want roadblocks. I want the SAS if necessary." Hamish ignored him. He followed the dark trail, Luggs trotting nervously at his heels, his ears flattened back. The trail led directly to the tallest of the standing stones, a jagged pillar of granite that local legend claimed was a petrified giant. As Hamish rounded the stone, he stopped dead. The driver was not missing. He had been found. The young man, barely 20 years old, was draped over the top of a smaller, flat sacrificial stone in a way that was almost theatrical. He was wearing his neat company uniform, but it was now ruined. He hadn't been shot or stabbed in any conventional sense. Instead, he had been wedged into a large decorative Christmas wreath, the kind with heavy wire framing and plastic holly. The wreath was pulled tight around his neck, acting as a garrote, and his tongue protruded slightly, blue and swollen. But the bizarre touch, the part that made Hamish's stomach do a slow, sick roll, was the victim's head. It had been dusted entirely with white confectioner's sugar, and a single glittery silver bauble had been shoved into his open mouth. "Oh, dear God!" Miss Thorne gasped from behind him. She didn't scream. She simply turned on her heel and began to retch into the heather. Percival Vane pushed past Hamish, his bluster momentarily silenced by the macabre sight. Is that the delivery boy? My God, look at the mess he's made of that stone. It's a historical landmark." Hamish looked at Vane, and for a fleeting second the lazy Highland policeman vanished. His eyes were as hard and cold as the North Sea. "A man is dead, Mr. Vane, a young lad with a mother, and likely a sweetheart, murdered in a way that's meant to mock him. I think the state of the stone is the least of our worries." Hamish knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb the ground. He didn't touch the man, but he observed the way the sugar had clumped in the damp air. It was fresh. The murder had happened within the hour. The killer had stayed long enough to perform this grotesque ritual, yet they had vanished into the mist without leaving a single footprint on the rocky soil surrounding the stones. The silence of the glen was suddenly shattered by the distant, aggressive wail of a siren. It wasn't the steady, polite peep of a local ambulance. It was the high-pitched, self-important shriek of the Strathbane police. Hamish groaned internally. The news must have travelled fast through the Highlands' invisible grapevine, or Vane had bypassed him and called the Chief Constable directly. "That'll be Detective Chief Inspector Blair," Hamish muttered to Luggs, who let out a low, mournful cry. "The peace of Lochdubh is well and truly finished now. We'll have boots trampling the evidence and voices loud enough to wake Cailleach herself." He stood up, brushing the peat from his trousers. He looked at the boy again, the silver bauble glinting mockingly in the dull light. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Nobody killed a man and decorated him like a Christmas tree just for a crate of wine. This was a message, or a very dark joke. In Lochdubh, jokes usually had a long, bitter history behind them. As the blue lights of Blair's car began to pulse through the fog like a fever dream, Hamish felt the familiar weight of a headache beginning to form behind his eyes. He wouldn't be getting back to his coffee or his seed catalogue today. The heavy tires of a black Ford Granada crunched violently over the gravel and peat, skidding to a halt just inches from the delivery van's open rear doors. Even before the engine had finished its final wheezing gasp, the driver's side door flew open with such force it nearly bounced off its hinges. Out stepped Detective Chief Inspector Blair, a man whose physical presence was defined primarily by a neck that seemed to have been swallowed by his shoulders and a face that remained a permanent, pulsating shade of ultraviolet. Behind him trailed two subordinates, looking like whipped curses in cheap suits, already bracing themselves for the inevitable storm of their superior's temper. Blair didn't look at the scenery, the ancient stones, or the grieving majesty of the hills. He looked straight at Hamish Macbeth, his eyes narrowing until they were mere slits of malice buried in folds of pale flesh. He stomped through the mud, his heavy brogues ruining any faint impressions the killer might have left in the soft earth, a fact that made Hamish wince inwardly. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice echoing the granite monoliths. "I might have known. Every time there's a spot of bother in this god-forsaken wilderness, I find you standing around looking like you've just been pulled through a hedge backwards. Look at the state of you. Is it a tie or discarded kelp? Stand up straight, man." Hamish slowly straightened his long frame, carefully adopting his most vacant, wide-eyed expression. "Good morning to you, sir. It's a sad business we have here, a tragedy for such a young lad." "I don't need a sermon from a Gaelic peasant," Blair snapped, pushing past Hamish so roughly that Luggs had to scramble out of the way, letting out a sharp, indignant yelp. Blair marched toward the standing stones, coming to an abrupt halt as he laid eyes on the victim. For a moment, even Blair's legendary arrogance was momentarily stunned into silence by the sheer absurdity of the corpse. He stared at the sugar-dusted head and the silver bauble, his jaw working silently before he finally found his voice. What in the name of the Lord is this? Is this some Highland joke? Some druid nonsense you get up to when the tourists aren't looking? It's a murder, sir, Hamish said softly, his voice a gentle contrast to Blair's roar. A very cruel one. The lad's been garroted with that wreath. I can see that, you lanky streak of nothing. Blair spun around, his face deepening to a bruised purple. It's obviously a robbery. Vane, you there, the Englishman. He gestured toward Percival Vane, who was hovering nearby, looking both horrified and strangely energized by the arrival of a real policeman. You reported a theft of wine, didn't you? Some local hooligan wanted your booze. The boy put up a fight and the thief got carried away with the Christmas spirit. Simple, open and shut. But the sugar, sir, and the bauble? Hamish ventured, tilting his head. It seems a lot of trouble to go just for a crate of Bordeaux. And the way the body's been laid out. It's almost like a window display in a fancy shop. Blair marched up to Hamish until they were chest to chest, though Blair had to crane his neck to look the taller man in the eye. The smell of stale cigarettes and peppermint breath mints hit Hamish like a physical blow. Listen to me, Macbeth. You are a village bobby. You are here to tell people to move their tractors and find lost cats. You are not a detective. This is a crime of passion and greed. Some local drunk, probably that poaching friend of yours, Geordie, saw the wine, lost his head, and decided to have a bit of fun with the body. I'll have a confession out of some local by nightfall. I don't think Geordie would waste good sugar like that, sir, Hamish murmured, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. He's a very thrifty man. Blair let out a sound that was half laugh, half snarl. He's a thief, like everyone else. Now clear off. Take your flea-bitten mongrel and get back to the village. I want you to stay by your phone and wait for instructions. Don't touch anything, don't talk to anyone. And for heaven's sake, try to find a comb. You're a disgrace to the uniform. Hamish watched as Blair's team began to clumsily cordon off the area with yellow tape, their heavy movements further obliterating the delicate scene. He saw one of the officers accidentally kick a small white scrap of paper into a puddle, and his heart sank. He knew that if he stayed, he would only be a target for Blair's escalating rage. He also knew that Blair would never find the killer, because Blair didn't understand Lochdubh. To Blair, the villagers were just obstacles or suspects. He didn't realize that in a place this small, the truth didn't hide in forensics or fingerprints. It hid in the things people said over a pint of heavy, or the way a neighbor looked at a house when they thought no one was watching. "Come away, lugs," Hamish whispered, turning his back on the shouting and the blue lights. "The professionals do not want us." As he walked back to his Land Rover, he passed Percival Vane, who was now busy giving Blair a list of the most suspicious people in the village, a list that seemed to include everyone who hadn't touched their forelock to him in the street. Hamish caught the eye of Miss Thorne, who was standing by the van. For a second, her icy composure slipped, and he saw a flicker of something, not just horror, but a sharp, calculating intelligence that didn't match her trophy persona. She looked at the body, then at Hamish, and then quickly turned away. Hamish climbed back into his vehicle, the dampness of the seat seeping through his trousers. He didn't start the engine immediately. He sat and watched the mist swirl around the standing stones. Blair thought it was a robbery. Vane thought it was a conspiracy of the poor against the rich. But Hamish had seen the precision of that wreath, the way the sugar had been applied with a terrifying, domestic neatness. This wasn't the work of a local drunk or a panicked thief. This was the work of someone who felt a very specific, very personal kind of hate. And as the rain began to fall again, turning the grey har into a steady drizzle, Hamish knew he wouldn't be staying by the phone. He was going to go where the gossip was thickest, and he was going to start by finding out exactly who in Lochdubh had a reason to turn a delivery boy into a Christmas decoration. Hamish drove the Land Rover back down the winding track toward Lochdubh, the rhythm of the windshield wipers providing a steady beat to his racing thoughts. He could still see Blair in his rear-view mirror, a small, angry purple dot amidst the vast, indifferent landscape of the Highlands. The DCI would spend the next several hours making a mess of the crime scene and intimidating anyone with a local accent, which gave Hamish exactly the window he needed. He did not return to the police station. Instead, he steered the vehicle toward the centre of the village, parking near the harbour where the smell of salt and diesel fuel hung heavy in the damp air. Lugs hopped out the moment the door opened, shaking himself vigorously and sending a spray of cold water over Hamish's shins. "Behave yourself, man," Hamish muttered, though his heart wasn't in the rebuke. He made a beeline for the village shop and post office, a cramped, overstuffed establishment run by Mrs. Kennedy. The shop was the central nervous system of Lochdubh. If a secret existed in the village, it usually passed through Mrs. Kennedy's hands along with the pension checks and the bags of sugar. As the bell above the door gave its tinny ring, Hamish was greeted by a wall of warmth and the scent of floor wax and peppermint. Mrs. Kennedy was behind the counter, her spectacles perched on the very tip of her nose, her eyes bright with the predatory gleam of a woman who had just heard something juicy and was waiting for a second source to confirm it. "Oh, it's you, Hamish," she said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper that could have been heard in the next county. "The whole village is talking. They say a poor soul was found up by the stones, done up like a department store turkey. Is it true?" Hamish leaned against the counter, his posture sagging into the comfortable, non-threatening shape of a man with nowhere to be and nothing on his mind. "It's a sad day, Mrs. Kennedy, a very strange and sad day. A young lad from the city just delivering his hampers. It's hard to imagine why anyone would want to hurt a boy like that." Mrs. Kennedy leaned forward, her elbows resting on a display of woolen socks. "A city boy, you say? Well, he wasn't the only stranger poking around Vane's place this week. That Mr. Vane has been hiring and firing help like he's playing with lead soldiers. Did you know he sacked the local girl, Morag, just 3 days ago? Said she wasn't efficient enough. The poor lass was in here crying her eyes out because her mother needs the medicine money." Hamish tucked that detail away. Morag was a quiet girl, hardly the type to garrote a stranger. But her brothers were a different matter, short-tempered lads with a deep-seated resentment for the likes of Percival Vane. "That's a shame, to be sure. How about wine, Mrs. Kennedy? Mr. Vane seems more upset about his missing bottles than the poor driver." "Wine?" Mrs. Kennedy snorted. "The man is a fool. He had a row in this very shop yesterday with a man from the city, a tall, slick fellow in a long black coat. They were arguing about deliveries and deadlines. It didn't sound like a conversation about grapes to me, Hamish. It sounded like business, the nasty kind." Hamish nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to a shelf of baking supplies. "Speaking of deliveries, you wouldn't happen to know who's been buying up large quantities of confectioner's sugar lately? The fine, white, powdery sort." Mrs. Kennedy frowned, her mental Rolodex of purchases spinning. "Now that you mention it, it's been a busy week for the bakers. Mrs. Wellington took 3 bags for the church social, and the hotel took a crate. But there was one person who bought 4 boxes yesterday morning. Strange, I thought, since she usually gets her cakes sent up from Glasgow." "And who was that?" Hamish asked, his voice barely a murmur. "Miss Thorne," Mrs. Kennedy whispered. "Vane's lady friend. Said she wanted to try her hand at a traditional Highland snowy cake. Though if that woman knows one end of a wooden spoon from the other, I'm a Dutchman." Hamish felt a small cold spark of interest. Cynthia Thorne, the woman who had looked so calculatingly at the body, buying excessive amounts of the very substance used to decorate the victim. It was a lead, but in Lochdubh, leads were often as mist-covered as the mountains. He thanked Mrs. Kennedy, bought a small, unnecessary tin of tobacco to justify his visit, and stepped back out into the rain. His next stop was the Lochdubh Hotel. He needed to see Angus, the barman, who saw the world through the bottom of a glass and heard the whispers that even Mrs. Kennedy missed. The public bar was nearly empty, save for a few local fishermen who looked up as Hamish entered, their faces etched with the weary suspicion they reserved for the law. "A half-pint of heavy Angus," Hamish said, sliding onto a stool. "And maybe a bit of that mutton pie, if there's any left from lunch." Angus, a man whose face resembled a topographical map of the Highlands, slid a glass toward him. "Terrible business up the hill, Hamish. Blair's been through here already, shouting for the guest register and insulting the decor. He thinks it's a local job. He's already got his eye on Geordie. Geordie was with me this morning, checking the river." Hamish lied effortlessly. "So it won't be him. Tell me, Angus, has anyone been staying here who seems a bit theatrical? Someone who likes things just so?" Angus leaned in, wiping the counter with a rag that had seen better decades. "There's a fellow in room 4, calls himself a consultant. He's been out at all hours, doesn't like the food, and spends a lot of time watching the road to Vane's Croft. But it's the girl, Hamish, the Thorn woman. She comes in here when Vane is busy and sits in the corner, nursing a gin and looking at her phone like she's waiting for a signal from a spy satellite. She's not what she seems, that one. Too sharp for a man like Vane." Hamish chewed his pie thoughtfully. The pieces were beginning to swirl around in his head, though they didn't yet fit. A sacked local girl, a mysterious consultant, a missing crate of wine that might not be wine, and a woman buying enough sugar to frost the entire village. He thought of the silver bauble in the boy's mouth, a touch of flair that felt more like a signature than a random act of violence. He finished his drink and stood up, feeling the eyes of the fishermen on his back. They expected him to do something, even if they didn't like the police. They expected him to protect the village from the darkness that Blair didn't even realize was there. As he stepped back into the grey light of the afternoon, Hamish knew his next move. He needed to speak to Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She moved in the circles that Vane and Thorn aspired to, and she had a way of seeing through the social masks that Hamish, as a lowly constable, was never supposed to notice. The mystery was no longer just about a dead boy, it was about the rot beneath the efficiency of the newcomers, and Hamish was beginning to realize that the sugar-dusted corpse was only the first layer of the frosting. The drive to Castle Halliburton was a short, sombre affair, the Land Rover's engine sounding more like a bag of loose bolts with every mile. Hamish kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was back at the village shop, weighing the weight of 4 boxes of confectioner's sugar. It was a domestic detail that felt entirely too deliberate. As he pulled into the sweeping gravel driveway of the Halberton Smythe estate, the rain eased into a thin, ghostly veil. The castle loomed over the loch with a weary, aristocratic grace, its stone walls darkened by centuries of Highland winters. Hamish felt the usual tug of self-consciousness as he straightened his tunic. Though he knew Priscilla wouldn't care if he arrived covered in peat, which, to be fair, he nearly was. Priscilla Halberton Smythe was in the drawing-room, the light of a dying fire playing across her pale, refined features. She looked up from her book as he was shown in, a faint, weary smile touching her lips. She was the one woman who could make Hamish feel both entirely seen and completely insignificant with a single glance. She was also the only person in the county who truly understood the game he played with the authorities in Strathbane. "Hamish," she said, her voice like silk over gravel, "I heard about the delivery boy. The village is in an uproar. My father is talking about installing more locks, which is a bit rich considering the castle hasn't been successfully breached since the 17th century. "It's a nasty business, Priscilla," Hamish replied, sinking into a chair that cost more than his annual salary. He accepted the tea she offered, the delicate bone china looking absurdly small in his large, calloused hand. DCI Blair is convinced it's a local thief with a sense of humour. He's currently trying to pin it on anyone who can't pronounce their R's the way they do in Edinburgh. Priscilla sighed, leaning back. Blair is a fool. He sees a crime as a puzzle of pieces, but he never looks at the picture on the box. "Tell me about Percival Vane. He's been trying to get a dinner invitation here for months. I've found him persistent. He's a loudmouthed Sassenach with too much money and a desperate need to feel important," Hamish said bluntly. "But it's his companion, Miss Thorne, that has me curious. Mrs. Kennedy says she's been buying up sugar by the crate, and Angus at the hotel says she's as sharp as a razor when Vane isn't looking." Priscilla's eyes sharpened. She set her teacup down with a precise, melodic click. "Cynthia Thorne. I've met her. She's not a trophy, Hamish. She's a predator in a Chanel suit. I watched her at the Strathbane charity auction last month. She didn't look at the art. She looked at the people bidding on it. She was cataloguing them. And Vane is terrified of her. He blusters to cover it up, but when she speaks, he jumps like a scolded cat." "Why would a woman like that be with a man like Vane?" Hamish mused, the steam from his tea warming his face. "He's an efficiency expert. Hardly a romantic figure." "Efficiency," Priscilla repeated the word with a frown. "Vane isn't an expert in anything but his own ego, but he does have a very specific set of connections in the shipping industry. My father mentioned that Vane was involved in a series of specialized logistics contracts before he retired, moving things that don't officially exist from ports that aren't on most maps." Hamish sat up, the lazy slump of his shoulders disappearing. "Logistics? Like a delivery van filled with vintage wine?" "Exactly. And Cynthia Thorne didn't appear in his life until those contracts began to sour. There was a rumour in London, one of those whispers that stays in the clubs, that Vane had misplaced a very high-value shipment belonging to some very unpleasant people. He moved to Lochdubh not to retire, Hamish, but to hide. He thought the Highlands were a place where the past couldn't find you." Hamish thought of sugar, silver baubles and wreaths. It wasn't a Highland joke, it was a signature. "The delivery boy," Hamish said softly. "He was the messenger, the way he was decorated. It's like a gift, a Merry Christmas from the people Vane tried to rob." Priscilla nodded slowly. "But why the sugar? Why the theatricality?" "Because," Hamish said, a dark realization dawning on him, "if you want to terrify a man like Vane, you don't just kill him. You show him that you can get into his world, his house, and his life, and turn it into a grotesque pantomime. Sugar was not just for the body. It's a message. They've been in the kitchen. They've been in the pantry. They're inside the walls." He stood, his tea forgotten. The social dynamics were clearer now. Vane was the prey. Thorne was likely the handler, or the traitor, and the delivery boy was the unfortunate casualty used to set the stage. But something still didn't fit. "Priscilla, you said Vane was shipping. If he stole something, it wouldn't be wine, it would be something small, something that could be hidden in a crate of Bordeaux." "Diamonds?" she suggested. "Or perhaps something more modern. Data? A prototype?" "Whatever it is," Hamish said, reaching for his cap, "it's still here in Lochdubh. The killer didn't take the wine just for the sake of it. They took it to see if the missing item was inside, and if they didn't find it, then they haven't finished their Christmas shopping," Priscilla finished for him, her face pale. Hamish felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with Highland humidity. He had to return to the village. If Blair arrested a local, the killer would be free to keep searching. The next gift left at the Standing Stones might be Percival Vane himself, or anyone who got in the way. As he walked out to the Land Rover, the wind began to howl through the battlements of the castle, a lonely, hungry sound that seemed to mock the festive season. He had been looking for a murderer, but he was starting to realize he was dealing with an executioner. He needed to find that missing crate of wine, and he needed to find it before the consultant in room 4 decided that a village constable was an unnecessary bit of local colour. "Thank you, Priscilla," he called back over his shoulder. "Be careful, Hamish," she replied, standing in the doorway. "The people Vane deals with don't care about village gossip, they only care about the bottom line." Hamish climbed into the driver's seat, Lugs greeting him with a concerned whine. He sat for a moment, staring at the grey expanse of the loch. He had a motive. He had a social circle of suspects, and he had a very bad feeling that the icing on the cake was about to get much thicker. The Land Rover's engine groaned as Hamish steered it away from the towering shadows of Castle Halberton and back toward the village. The rain had intensified, turning the landscape into a blurred watercolour of greens and greys. But Hamish's mind was sharp. Priscilla's insight into Vane's history of specialised logistics had provided the missing context. The sugar-dusted corpse wasn't a random act of madness. It was a cold, calculated warning. As he approached the village outskirts, the flashing blue lights of a police van parked outside the local community hall told him exactly what he had feared. DCI Blair was making his move. Hamish pulled over and stepped into the hall, which usually hosted whist drives and knitting circles. Now it was a makeshift interrogation centre. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of wet wool and Blair's cheap cologne. At the far end of the room, a young man sat slumped in a wooden chair, his face pale and tear-stained. It was Dougie, Morag's younger brother, the girl Vane had recently fired. Blair was standing over him, his face so close to the boys that their noses almost touched. "You thought you'd get even, didn't you?" Blair roared, slamming a hand onto the table. "Vane sacks your sister and you decide to hijack his fancy wine. The driver got in the way and you panicked. You always were a little psycho, weren't you, Dougie? Liked to play with your food. Is that why you put the sugar on him?" "I didn't do it," Dougie sobbed. "I was at the harbour all morning, ask anyone." "Nobody saw you," Blair sneered, turning as he spotted Hamish. Macbeth, come to witness a real arrest. I've found our man. The sisters have the motive and this little thug has the temperament. We found a bottle of expensive red under his bed. Care to explain that, Macbeth, or are you too busy thinking about your sheep?" Hamish looked at Dougie, then at the bottle sitting on the evidence table. It was indeed a vintage Bordeaux, the label slightly scuffed. But something felt wrong. Hamish wandered toward the back of the hall, appearing to be fascinated by a display of prize-winning jam jars from the autumn fair. He looked like a man daydreaming, but his eyes were scanning every inch of the floor and the furniture. Blair ignored him, returning to his shouting match with the terrified boy. Hamish's eyes settled on a pile of discarded coats by the door. There, tucked half behind a radiator, was a pair of boots belonging to the victim, or rather, a pair of boots that had been brought in with the evidence from the van. He remembered seeing them on the delivery boy's feet. Beside them lay the boy's jacket. Hamish knelt down, his back to Blair, and began to gently feel the lining of the coat. "Looking for a snack, Macbeth?" Blair yelled over his shoulder. "Or are you planning to knit Dougie a jumper for his stay in Barlinnie?" Hamish didn't answer. His fingers had found something. It wasn't in the pockets. It was a small, stiff square sewn into the shoulder padding, a place no casual thief would look. With a subtle flick of a pocket knife he kept for whittling, he nipped the thread. Out slid a small plastic-coated card. It wasn't a driver's license. It was a digital keycard for a high-security storage facility in London, but embossed on the corner was a tiny gold foil holly leaf. He pocketed the card instantly. Then he stood up and walked toward the evidence table, peering closely at the bottle of wine Blair had confiscated from Dougie's house. "That's a fine bottle, sir," Hamish said, his voice dripping with forced admiration. "A 1982 no less, but tell me, sir, did you notice the cork?" Blair blinked, momentarily derailed. "What about the cork? It's been pulled and put back in, sir. And not very well. If a boy like Dougie was going to steal a £500 bottle of wine, he'd either drink it or sell it. He wouldn't carefully uncork it, look inside, and then shove the cork back in with a mallet." Blair grabbed the bottle, his face reddening. "So what? Maybe he was looking for a prize, like a lucky dip. Or maybe," Hamish said softly, "the person who really stole the crate was looking for something that wasn't wine. And when they didn't find it in the first 11 bottles, they planted the 12th one under Dougie's bed to give you exactly the suspect you wanted. It's a very neat bit of work, sir. Efficient, you might say." "Are you accusing me of being led by the nose?" Blair's voice rose to a glass-shattering pitch. "I found the evidence. The boy's a thief. I'm taking him to Strathbane tonight." "I'm just saying, sir," Hamish continued, backing away with a humble shrug, "that if I were a clever killer from the city, I'd find the local man everyone already dislikes and give him a gift that looks like guilt." Hamish turned and walked out of the hall before Blair could erupt again. He had what he needed. The keycard was the real prize. The missing shipment Vane had been hiding. The delivery boy hadn't been an innocent bystander. He had been the courier, and the holly leaf on the card matched the festive theme of the murder. But the killer hadn't found the card because the boy had hidden it too well. As he stood in the rain, Hamish realized that the consultant at the hotel and Miss Thorne were likely working together, but they were running out of patience. They had tried to frame Dougie to get the police out of the way so they could finish searching Vane's house. If they realized the card wasn't in the wine, they'd go back to the source. He looked toward the hill where Vane's croft sat, its glass windows reflecting the cold grey sky. The red herring of Dougie's arrest had bought the real killer time, but it had also given Hamish the one thing Blair lacked: the truth. The motive wasn't the wine, and it wasn't the girl's job. It was that small plastic card in his pocket. He needed to get to Vane's house, but he couldn't go as a policeman. He needed to go as the lazy, bumbling Hamish who just happened to be looking for a lost sheep. He climbed back into the Land Rover, his heart thumping against his ribs. The red herring was about to be revealed as a much more dangerous lure, and Hamish knew that the next few hours would determine whether Lochdubh saw a quiet Christmas or a bloodbath. He started the engine, the card burning a hole in his pocket, and headed toward the one person who could help him set the final trap. The Land Rover climbed the steep, muddy track toward the Vane residence, the vehicle's heater blowing a futile breath of lukewarm air against the encroaching Highland chill. Hamish felt the weight of the keycard in his pocket like a hot coal. Blair was currently halfway to Strathbane with a terrified Dougie in the back of a van, convinced he had solved the crime of the century. It was the perfect diversion for real gamers. Hamish knew that the consultant from the hotel, a man who called himself Mr. Forbes, wouldn't be sitting in the public bar anymore. He would be exactly where the action was. As the glass-fronted croft came into view, Hamish saw the silver shimmer of a rented Mercedes parked crookedly near the entrance. Hamish didn't pull up to the front door. He steered the Land Rover into a thicket of birch trees a few hundred yards down the slope, cutting the engine. Lugs let out a low, vibrating growl, his hackles rising. "Shh, man," Hamish whispered, patting the dog's head. "We're just two simple souls out for a stroll in the rain." He reached into the back of the vehicle and pulled out an old, rusted shepherd's crook, a prop he often used when he wanted to look particularly harmless. He left his police cap on the dashboard, opting instead for a battered tweed hat that made him look like a wayward hill walker. As he approached the house on foot, keeping to the shadows of the gorse bushes, he saw a light flickering in the upper floor, not the steady glow of a lamp, but the erratic beam of a flashlight. Someone was searching. He moved toward the kitchen entrance, the side of the house where the delivery van had been headed before its fatal interruption. The door was slightly ajar, the lock not broken but neatly bypassed. Hamish slipped inside, his boots making no sound on the expensive slate flooring. The kitchen smelled of high-end coffee and something sharp, the chemical scent of cleaning fluid. On the marble island sat the remaining 11 bottles of Bordeaux, all uncorked. Beside them lay a small mountain of white confectioner's sugar, spilled carelessly across the counter. It wasn't for baking anymore, it was the residue of a frantic search. "I told you it wasn't in the bottles, Percival," a voice drifted down from the landing. It was Cynthia Thorne, her voice no longer clipped and polite, but sounding like a serrated blade. "The boy was smarter than you gave him credit for. He knew you were planning to double-cross the firm. He hid it." "I didn't tell him to hide it." Vane's voice followed, thin and reedy with genuine terror. "I just told him to bring the crate directly to the cellar. He was just a courier, Cynthia. He didn't know what was in the secondary casing." "He knew enough to realize that a consultant like Forbes doesn't travel to Lochdubh for the scenery," Thorne snapped. "And now Forbes is losing his patience. If that keycard isn't found within the hour, he's going to start decorating you, Percival, and believe me, he won't stop at a silver bauble." Hamish stood in the darkness of the pantry, his mind racing. The hidden motive wasn't a grudge against the wealthy, and it wasn't a local spat over a sacked girl. It was a cold-blooded corporate execution. Vane had stolen a digital key, likely to a vault containing the specialized logistics data Priscilla had mentioned, and had tried to use a local delivery service to smuggle it past his own handlers. The boy, sensing something was wrong, had tucked the card into his jacket. Forbes had killed him for it, only to find the shipment empty. The sugar, the wreath, the bauble, it was Forbes's psychological calling card, a way to break Vane's spirit before the final interrogation. Hamish peered through the crack in the door. He saw the consultant, Mr. Forbes, descending the stairs. He was exactly as Angus had described, tall, slick, and wearing a long black coat that seemed to swallow the light. He was holding a heavy, silenced pistol with the casual indifference of a man holding a fountain pen. "The police have their suspect," Forbes said, his voice a low, cultured hum. "The fat one, Blair, has taken the local boy. We have a clear window. Percival, where is the card? Did the boy have a locker, a girlfriend in the village?" "I don't know," Vane wailed. "I swear on my life." "Your life is currently a very devalued currency," Forbes remarked. He turned to Cynthia. "Check the girl, Morag. If the boy didn't have it, he might have passed it to her before he reached the gates. If she has it, kill her. We can't have any loose ends in this miserable puddle of a village." Hamish felt a cold rage boil in his chest. Morag was an innocent girl, already grieving for her brother's arrest, and now she was a target because of Varney's greed. He realized then that the villain wasn't just Forbes. It was the entire efficient world these people brought with them, a world where a human life was just a line item to be erased. The motive was petty in its essence, money and power, but the execution was monstrous. Forbes wasn't just a killer, he was a specialist in cleanup. And Cynthia Thorne wasn't Vane's mistress, she was the firm's auditor, sent to ensure the assets were recovered. Hamish eyed the sugar on the counter. He looked at the shepherd's crook in his hand. He couldn't call for backup. Blair was miles away and wouldn't believe him anyway. He had to be the useless peasant one last time. He had to set a trap that would make Forbes underestimate him long enough to tip the scales. He waited until Forbes and Thorne moved into the study, their voices muffled by the heavy oak door. He stepped out of the pantry and back into the kitchen. He took a deep breath, pitched his voice into a high, panicked quaver, and began to bang a copper pot against the marble island with a tremendous clattering din. "Mr. Vane! Mr. Vane!" Hamish shrieked, sounding like a man who had lost his wits. "The sheep! The sheep are in the garden! They're eating the prize roses! Oh, the humanity! Mr. Vane, come quick!" He heard the sharp silence from the study. He heard Forbes' heavy tread moving toward the door. Hamish dropped the pot, threw a handful of the confectioner's sugar over his own shoulder to look like he'd been fumbling in the dark, and collapsed onto the floor in a heap of gangly limbs, clutching the rusted shepherd's crook as if it were a holy relic. The door swung open, and the black muzzle of Forbes's pistol pointed directly at Hamish's head. Forbes stood in the doorway of the study, the silenced pistol held with a terrifying, steady grace. His eyes, cold and grey as a winter loch, raked over the scene in the kitchen, the spilled sugar, the clattering copper pot, and the spindly, red-haired constable sprawled on the slate floor looking like a confused scarecrow. Behind him, Cynthia Thorne peered out, her face a mask of annoyed disbelief, while Percival Vane hovered in the background, trembling so violently his teeth were audible. To them, Hamish was the embodiment of Highland incompetence, a man who had literally tripped over his own feet while worrying about livestock. "Macbeth," Forbes said, the word dripping with fatal boredom, "what on earth are you doing here? I thought the illustrious DCI Blair ordered you back to your kennel." Hamish scrambled to his knees, his eyes wide and roaming frantically around the room, never quite settling on the gun. He looked exactly like a man who was too stupid to realize he was about to be shot. "Oh, Mr. Forbes, sir, it's the sheep. I was just passing by, checking the fences, you see, and I saw the gates were open. The black-face ewes are in the ornamental garden, and I thought, Hamish, if those sheep eat Mr. Vane's imported shrubbery, there'll be the devil to pay. I came to find a whistle, and I slipped. I'm a clumsy fool, sir." A total embarrassment to the uniform. He began to frantically clean the spilled sugar with his sleeve, actually spreading it further across the floor. And look at this mess. I've ruined the baking. Miss Thorne will be wanting her snowy cakes, and here I am rolling in the ingredients like a pig in a clover." Forbes lowered the pistol slightly, though he did not holster it. The sheer absurdity of Hamish's presence was acting as a psychological buffer. No one, Forbes reasoned, could possibly be this thick-headed if they knew what was really happening in this house. "Get up, Macbeth," Forbes commanded, "and stop that infernal babbling. We are in the middle of a private security briefing. You are trespassing." "Trespassing? Oh, no, sir," Hamish said, finally standing up and leaning heavily on his rusted shepherd's crook. He took a staggering step forward, his boot sliding in the sugar. "I'm on official duty, protecting the roses. But oh, before I forget—" He reached into his pocket, his fingers fumbling with a clumsy, exaggerated lack of coordination. "I found something in the van. I think it belongs to the lad, the one Blair took away. I didn't mean to tell DCI, you see. He's a very shouty man, and I didn't want to get in the way of his big arrest." The kitchen atmosphere changed instantly. The boredom vanished from Forbes's eyes, replaced by a predatory hunger. Cynthia Thorne stepped forward, her hand reaching instinctively. Even Vane stopped trembling for a second, leaning over the landing rail. "What did you find, Macbeth?" Forbes asked, his voice now a soft, dangerous purr. Hamish pulled his hand out of his pocket, but kept his fist tightly clenched. "It's a bit of plastic, sir. Looks like a club card or a library pass. I thought maybe the lad dropped it during the unpleasantness. If it belongs to the delivery company, maybe it has the address of where they kept the rest of the wine. My cousin Geordie says there's still a crate missing, and he's very worried about the waste." "Give it to me," Forbes said, extending his left hand while keeping the pistol levelled with his right. "Now, sir, I should probably take it to the station," Hamish said, adopting a stubborn, rustic look. "There's procedures, you know, forms to fill out, blue ones for plastic, yellow ones for metal. It's a terrible amount of paperwork, and I was hoping maybe you could just tell me what it is first to save me the trouble." "Give it to me." Forbes approached, his finger tightening on the trigger. Hamish sighed, the sound of a man defeated by bureaucracy. "Very well, sir, but it's very small. You'll need to look close to see the writing. It's got a little gold leaf on it, very festive." Hamish stepped into the centre of the kitchen, directly under the heavy iron pot rack that hung from the ceiling. He held his closed fist towards Forbes. The assassin, driven by the need to recover the multi-million-pound keycard, stepped into the trap. He moved within arm's reach of Hamish, his eyes focused entirely on the constable's hand. As Forbes reached for the imaginary card, Hamish didn't open his hand. Instead, he swung the heavy rusted shepherd's crook with a sudden violent grace that would have stunned Blair. He didn't hit Forbes, he hooked the crook around the release lever of the ornate pot rack, a feature Vane had bragged about during a previous inspection for being a genuine antique from a French chateau. With a sharp metallic clack, the mechanism gave way. A dozen heavy copper pans and the iron frame itself came crashing down. Forbes, caught completely off guard, tried to jump back, but his feet hit the thick layer of confectioner's sugar Hamish had been so clumsily spreading across the slate floor. His shoes lost all traction. He slid forward, his arms windmilling, just as the iron rack slammed into his shoulder and chest, pinning him to the floor in a cacophony of ringing metal. The pistol flew from his hand, skidding across the sugar-slicked floor. "Macbeth!" Cynthia Thorne shrieked, reaching into her own handbag, but she was too slow. Hamish, no longer looking like a bumbling shepherd, lunged forward with the surprising speed of a hunting cat. He didn't go for the woman, he went for the gun. He scooped it up, rolled across the floor, and came up in a crouch, the silenced weapon pointed directly at Thorne's chest. "I wouldn't, Miss Thorne," Hamish said, his voice as steady and cold as the rain outside. "I might be a useless peasant, but I've been practicing my aim on the crows since I was 6 years old, and crows are much smaller targets than you." Thorne froze, her hand still halfway in her bag. Under the pot rack, Forbes let out a groan of agony, his face white with shock. Vane, seeing the tide turn, let out a pathetic whimper and retreated into the shadows of the upstairs hallway. You set this up, Forbes wheezed, struggling against the weight of the copper pans. The sugar, the sheep, it was all a lie.
There are no sheep in the garden, Mr. Forbes, Hamish said mildly, though he didn't lower the gun. But there is a very real murder charge waiting for you in Strathbane.
You see, the thing about being a stupid policeman is that people tell you everything because they think you won't understand. Miss Thorne here told me exactly who you were when she bought 4 boxes of sugar. People in Lochdubh don't bake that much, not even at Christmas. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out the real key card, the gold holly leaf glinting in the kitchen light. The boy hid this well. He was a good lad. He didn't deserve to be turned into a decoration for the likes of you. Lugs, sensing the danger, had passed into a stalemate, trotted into the room and let out a sharp, triumphant bark, standing over the pinned Forbes with his hackles raised. Hamish didn't relax his guard. He knew the standoff wasn't over until the handcuffs were on, but he also knew that the trap had worked perfectly. He had used their own arrogance against them. They had seen a fool because they wanted to see a fool, and in the Highlands that was usually the last mistake a Sassenach ever made. "Now then," Hamish said, his Highland lilt returning to its gentle, deceptive rhythm, "I think it's time we had a proper chat, and since DCI Blair is currently busy arresting the wrong man, I suppose I'll just have to handle the paperwork myself. It'll be a terrible bother, Miss Thorne. All those yellow forms." He backed toward the wall, reaching for the wall-mounted telephone with his free hand. He didn't call the police station, he called the Lochdubh Hotel. "Angus," Hamish said into the receiver, his eyes never leaving Thorne, "be a good man and tell the boys at the bar to finish their pints and head up to Vane's place. Tell them I've got a heavy lifting job that needs doing, and there might be a crate of vintage Bordeaux in it for their trouble. Oh, and Angus, tell them to bring some rope, the sturdy kind." The silence that followed Hamish's telephone call to the hotel was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of rain against the expansive glass panes of the kitchen and the low, pained groans of Mr. Forbes. The consultant lay pinned beneath the iron pot rack, a modern-day knight unhorsed by a collection of antique copper. Cynthia Thorne remained motionless, her eyes darting between the barrel of the silenced pistol in Hamish's hand and the door. She was calculating her odds, but Hamish could see the moment she realized they had plummeted to 0. In the Highlands, a man like Hamish Macbeth was a permanent fixture, as rooted as the mountains, while people like her were merely passing storms. "You won't kill me, Macbeth," Thorne said, her voice regaining a bit of its icy composure, though her hands were trembling. "You're a policeman. You're bound by the rules that make you so delightfully predictable. If you shoot me, you'll spend the rest of your life in a cell and you'll never see your precious loch again." Hamish tilted his head, his expression one of mild, almost academic interest. "You're right about one thing, Miss Thorne. I do love my loch. And I'm a man who hates paperwork above all. A shooting would involve a terrible number of statements and internal inquiry and probably a team of psychologists from Edinburgh coming up here to ask me about my childhood. It sounds exhausting." He shifted his grip on the pistol, his hazel eyes hardening. "But then again, the mist is very thick tonight. If you were to try and run and happen to trip and fall into the loch, well, the currents this time of year are very unforgiving. It might take weeks to find you, if at all, and I'd only have to fill out one small form for a missing person." The colour drained from Thorne's face. She didn't know if he was joking, and that was the core of Hamish's power. In his quiet, unassuming way, he carried a spark of the old wild Highlands that didn't care for the laws of men. "Percival!" she screamed toward the stairs. "Do something, you coward!" Vane appeared at the top of the landing, looking like a man who had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. He held a heavy glass decanter, clutching it like a weapon, but his eyes were wide with a pathetic, watery terror. I didn't want any of this, Macbeth. They forced me. Forbes said they'd kill me if I didn't help recover the card. I'm a victim here." "You're a greedy fool, Vane," Hamish said, not looking up. "You brought a wolf into your house and expected it to act like a lapdog. And because of your logistics, a young lad is lying on a cold stone with sugar in his hair. You're no victim. You're just a man who ran out of luck." The sound of multiple engines began to grow outside, the rugged, uncoordinated roar of Land Rovers and tractors. The cavalry of Lochdubh had arrived. Moments later, the kitchen door was thrown open, and a group of large, weathered men in oilskins and flat caps poured in, led by Angus the barman and Geordie the poacher. They took in the scene with the stoic detachment of men who had seen everything from stranded whales to brawling tourists. "Aye, Hamish," Geordie said, spitting a bit of tobacco into a nearby bin. "You look like you've had a busy evening. Is this the fellow who's been messing with the delivery vans?" He looked at Forbes with a mix of curiosity and contempt. "That's him, Geordie," Hamish replied, finally lowering the pistol as his friends surrounded the intruders. And the lady in the expensive shoes was his supervisor. "Mr. Forbes is a bit tied up at the moment, as you can see, but Miss Thorne was just thinking about leaving. I think it would be best if you boys helped them wait for the proper authorities. The real ones." Angus stepped forward, his massive hands resting on his hips. "And what about the wine, Hamish? We heard there was a bit of a dispute over a crate of Bordeaux." Hamish gestured toward the counter. "The wine is evidence, Angus, but I suspect Mr. Vane here would be more than happy to donate a few bottles to the village hall for the Christmas dance, considering the trouble he's caused. Isn't that right, Mr. Vane?" Vane nodded frantically from the landing. Yes, of course. Take it all. Just keep them away from me." The confrontation moved into a phase of organized chaos. The villagers, with the practiced efficiency of men who handled livestock and heavy machinery daily, lifted the pot rack just enough for Geordie to drag Forbes out. The assassin was bruised and likely had a broken collarbone, but he was alive. They bound his hands and feet with sturdy nautical rope from Angus's boat, ignoring his hissed threats of legal action. Thorne was escorted to a chair and surrounded by 3 of the county's largest fishermen, who stood over her with the silent, immovable presence of stone pillars. Hamish stood back, watching the scene. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by a familiar, bone-deep weariness. He looked at the keycard in his hand. This small piece of plastic represented a world of high-stakes theft and corporate murder, a world that had tried to swallow Lochdubh whole. He knew that the moment Blair found out about this, the DCI would try to claim the glory. But Hamish didn't care about glory. He cared about the fact that Dougie was sitting in a cell in Strathbane, and that a killer was now properly trussed up like a Christmas ham. "Geordie," Hamish said, beckoning his friend, "I need you to do me a favour. Take my Land Rover and drive to the village. Find the phone box near the harbour, not the one in the shop, mind you, and call the Chief Constable's private residence. Don't call the station. Tell him that Constable Macbeth has apprehended the real killers of the delivery boy and has recovered the stolen property. Tell him if he wants the credit, he'd better get here before DCI Blair makes any more of a fool of himself." Geordie grinned, a gap-toothed expression of pure mischief. "You're a devious man, Hamish. You're giving the big boss the prize just to spite the little one. It's called logistics, Geordie," Hamish said with a tired smile. "I've been learning all about it tonight." As Geordie left, Hamish turned his attention back to the room. The villagers were already beginning to clear up the spilled sugar, and Angus was eyeing the remaining bottles of wine with a professional's appreciation. The crisis was over. The arrest was as messy and Highland style as any Hamish had ever made, but the true work, the shifting of credit and the preservation of his own quiet life, was just beginning. He walked over to the kitchen table, sat down and looked at Lugs. "Well, Lugs," he murmured, "I think we've earned a bit of peace. But first we have to deal with the DCI, and I suspect he's going to be very, very red in the face." The sound of distant sirens, different ones this time, more formal and numerous, began to echo through the glen. The Chief Constable was coming, and with him the end of the vanished Christmas guest. Hamish reached for a discarded piece of shortbread on the counter, took a bite and waited. He had solved the mystery. protected the village, and managed to stay out of the line of fire. Now all he had to do was look like a man who had no idea how any of it had happened. The sirens that approached Vane's Croft were not the erratic, frantic shrieks of a single patrol car, but a disciplined chorus of authority. The chief constable had arrived in force. As the blue lights pulsed against the fog-shrouded glass of the house, a team of officers who looked significantly more professional than the bedraggled crew DCI Blair usually commanded swept the front door open. In the center of the kitchen, Hamish Macbeth was the picture of bewildered passivity. He was sitting on a wooden stool, a damp tea towel in one hand and a half-eaten biscuit in the other, while Forbes remained trussed on the floor like a maritime parcel, and Cynthia Thorne glowered from her chair. The chief constable, a man of immense dignity and even more immense eyebrows named Sir Ronald, stepped into the room. He took in the sight of the bound assassin, the scattered copper pans, and the village constable, who looked as though he had just wandered in to ask for directions. "Macbeth," Sir Ronald said, his voice booming with the weight of a man who owned several islands, "I received a rather urgent and somewhat cryptic message. Care to explain why the man wanted for a series of high-level security thefts in London is currently tied up with Highland sheepshank knots in Percival Vane's kitchen?" Hamish stood up slowly, wiping his hands on his trousers and adopting his most humble, stumbling lilt. "Oh, Sir Ronald, it's been a terrible misunderstanding, really. I was just up here checking on the, cattle, as I do, and I found these city folk having a bit of a disagreement. There was a lot of shouting about cards and wine, and then the pot rack just fell. A total architecture accident, you might say. I just helped tidy up until the real police could arrive." At that moment, the back door burst open, and DCI Blair stormed in, his face reaching a shade of obsidian purple that suggested an imminent medical event. He had clearly heard the news on the radio, and had raced back from his aborted trip to Strathbane, leaving the innocent Dougie in the care of his subordinates. "Macbeth!" Blair screamed, ignoring the presence of the chief constable in his blind rage. "What is this? Told you to stay in the village. I have the suspect in custody. I have a motive. You're interfering with a major investigation, you lanky red-haired—" "DCI Blair," Sir Ronald interrupted, his voice like a glacier carving. Blair froze, his mouth still open in a snarl. He blinked, finally noticing the superior officer and the elite team currently bagging the silenced pistol and the digital key card. "Sir, I was just— Macbeth here has clearly staged some kind of amateur dramatics to confuse the case. I've already arrested the local boy Dougie. He's the killer." Sir Ronald looked at the bound Forbes, then at the key card on the evidence tray. "The local boy, Blair, is currently being released with a full apology. This man on the floor is a known professional. The card recovered here is worth more than your entire pension fund, and from what I can gather, it was Constable Macbeth who managed to secure the scene while you were busy bullying a teenager." Hamish saw the trap closing on him, the trap of promotion. If he allowed Sir Ronald to believe he was the mastermind behind the capture, he'd be whisked away to a desk in Inverness or Glasgow within the week. He had to act fast to preserve his lethargy. "Now, Sir Ronald, that's not quite right," Hamish said, stepping forward with a look of earnest apology. "I'm just a village bobby. It was actually DCI Blair's brilliant strategy that did it. He told me, he did, back at the station. He said, 'Macbeth, I'm going to make a feint. I'm going to take the boy in so the real killers think they're safe. I want you to lurk around the croft and keep an eye out while I draw them into a false sense of security.' Those were your very words, weren't they, sir?" Hamish looked at Blair with a wide, innocent gaze. Blair, whose brain was currently trying to reconcile his hatred for Hamish with his desperate need to save his career, hesitated for only a second. The prospect of taking credit for a brilliant feint was too much for the DCI to resist. Yes, Blair stammered, puffing out his chest and trying to look like a master tactician. Exactly, Sir Ronald. A standard misdirection play. I knew the boy was innocent, of course. I just needed to clear the field so Macbeth could act as my eyes and ears on the ground. It went exactly to plan. Sir Ronald looked between the sweating, arrogant DCI and the humble, vacuous-looking constable. He was no fool. He knew exactly what was happening, but he also knew that paperwork was easier when the hierarchy was maintained. A constable solving a major crime made the department look disorganized. A DCI solving it with a misdirection play looked like a triumph of leadership. "I see," Sir Ronald said dryly. "A very creative piece of police work, Blair. I shall expect a full report on my desk by Monday. And I suppose Macbeth here deserves a small mention for his lurking." "Oh, no need for that, sir," Hamish said, waving a hand dismissively. "I'm just happy the boy Dougie is going home, and I'm sure the DCI will handle all the statements and the court appearances. It's far too much for a man of my limited intellect." Blair's eyes lit up. To him, the paperwork was a small price to pay for the commendation he now saw dancing in his future. He turned on Hamish, his arrogance fully restored. "You heard the Chief, Macbeth. Clear off. You've done your bit of lurking. I'll take it from here, and don't think this means you're off the hook for that tie. It's still a disgrace." Hamish touched his forelock in a mock salute, his heart light. He had done it. He had caught the killers, saved the boy, and successfully offloaded the grueling weeks of legal testimony and administrative drudgery onto the man who deserved it most. As he whistled for lugs, he saw the villagers, Angus and Geordie, standing by the door. They gave him a knowing wink as he passed. They knew who had really set the trap, but they also knew the value of a quiet life in Lochdubh. "Come on, lugs," Hamish whispered as they stepped out into the cold midnight air. "Let the professionals handle the glory. We have a fire to stoke and a pot of coffee that's been waiting far too long." As he drove the Land Rover down the hill, the blue lights fading in the rearview mirror, Hamish felt a profound sense of satisfaction. The Sassenach mystery was over. Vine would likely sell the croft and flee back to the safety of London. Thorne and Forbes would face the cold reality of a Scottish prison, and the delivery boy would have justice, even if his name never made the front page of the papers. The Highlands had a way of swallowing secrets, and Hamish Macbeth was more than happy to let this one be buried under the official seal of DCI Blair's ego. The rain had finally stopped, and for a brief moment the clouds parted to reveal a sliver of a silver moon reflecting on the still waters of the loch. It was a beautiful, silent world, and as long as everyone believed he was a lazy, useless policeman, Hamish would be allowed to stay and watch over it. He reached into his pocket and felt the empty space where the keycard had been. He didn't need plastic cards or vintage wine. He had his dog, his station, and the enduring peace of the glen. The following morning the sun broke through the Highland mist with a rare watery brilliance, turning the surface of Lochdubh into a sheet of hammered silver. Inside the police station the air was thick with the scent of frying bacon and the familiar earthy tang of peat smoke. Hamish Macbeth stood over his small stove, expertly flipping a pancake while Lugs watched with the focused intensity of a diamond appraiser. The morning newspapers, delivered by a still shaken but profoundly grateful Dougie, was spread across the wooden table. The headlines were exactly as Hamish had orchestrated: DCI Blair smashes international smuggling ring, and mastermind police tactics lead to Highland arrests. There was a grainy photograph of Blair looking remarkably smug, standing next to a covered evidence tray that presumably held the digital keycard. Hamish's name didn't appear once, a fact that brought a genuine, relaxed smile to his face. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his breakfast. It was Priscilla Halberton-Smythe, looking radiant in a heavy wool coat, her cheeks flushed from the morning air. "I see you're back to your usual state of industriousness, Hamish," she said, eyeing the sizzling pan. "The whole village is talking about the great sting operation Blair conducted. My father is even considering sending him a letter of commendation, "Aye, the DCI is a very brave man when the suspects are already tied up," Hamish replied, sliding a pancake onto a plate and offering it to her. "He'll be busy in Strathbane for months with the inquiry. It'll be a very quiet Christmas in Lochdubh, thank the Lord." Priscilla sat up, her expression growing serious. "And the boy? The one who was murdered?" "His family will be looked after," Hamish said softly, his gaze drifting to the window. "I had a word with Sir Ronald. It seems the specialized logistics firm has an insurance policy for such irregularities, and Mr. Vane, in his haste to leave the Highlands this morning, decided to leave behind a very substantial donation for a memorial scholarship in the lad's name. I suggested it might be good for his soul, and he seemed to agree once I mentioned I still had his original statement regarding the poached salmon he bought last month." Priscilla laughed, a bright sound that filled the small room. "You're a terrible man, Hamish Macbeth. You solve the crimes, let the villains pay the bills, and let the fools take the credit. All so you can sit here and fry bacon. It's a balanced ecosystem, Priscilla," he said with a wink. After she left, Hamish finished his meal in peace. He took a final look at the newspaper, then used the front page, the one featuring Blair's triumphant face, to help light the evening fire. He watched the ink curl and blacken in the heat. The Sassenach intrusion was over, the greed of the city had been repelled by the simplicity of the hills, and the natural order had been restored. He poured himself a fresh mug of coffee and stepped out onto the porch. The air was crisp and clean, the salt spray of the loch mingling with the scent of pine. He looked out over the water, where a lone heron stood sentry on a rock. There would be more trouble eventually, there always was. Someone would lose a sheep, a tourist would get stuck in a bog, or another outsider would arrive with dreams of improving the Highlands. But for now, the village was safe, the fire was warm, and Hamish Macbeth was exactly where he wanted to be. "Come on, Lugs," he murmured, patting the dog's head as he sat in his old wicker chair. "I think we've done enough work to last us until at least the spring." The dog let out a contented sigh and curled up at his feet. The Highlands were quiet once more, and in the small village of Lochdubh, that was the greatest mystery of all.